He mocked me as a nobody. So, I purchased the factory that produced his entire line. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. What they don't tell you is that sometimes it takes 3 years of ramen noodles and rejected proposals to get the recipe just right. My name is Mia Harper, and I'm about to tell you how I went from being called a nobody to owning everything that mattered to the man who destroyed me. But first, let me take you back to that October night in 2021, the night that changed everything. The rooftop of the Meridian building in downtown Chicago was buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes when rich people smell an opportunity to get richer. Crystal glasses clinked against the backdrop of the city skyline, and I stood there in my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought specifically for this moment, watching my entire world crumble in real time. Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan Kross announced to the crowd of potential investors, his voice carrying that confident charm that had once made my heart skip beats. Now, it just made my stomach turn. I'd like to present the revolutionary strategy that's going to take Crossline Athletic from a startup to a household name. I watched from the corner, my hands trembling as he clicked through the PowerPoint presentation. My PowerPoint presentation. Every slide, every graph, every brilliant insight about market penetration and demographic targeting, all of it was mine. I'd spent 6 months developing that strategy, working 16-hour days, believing we were building something together. The crowd was captivated. Of course they were. The plan was flawless because I'd made it flawless. The key, Ethan continued, his perfectly styled blonde hair catching the city lights, is understanding that athletic wear isn't just about performance anymore. It's about identity, community, and aspirational lifestyle. We're not just selling clothes, we're selling transformation. Those were my exact words. I'd said them to him over dinner at that little Italian place on State Street, back when I thought we were partners in every sense of the word. Marcus Henley, one of Chicago's biggest venture capitalists, raised his hand. This is impressive, Ethan. Who developed this market analysis? My heart pounded. This was it. This was the moment Ethan would acknowledge my work, my contribution, I did, Ethan said without missing a beat. It's what happens when you combine Harvard business training with real-world instinct. The lie hit me like a physical blow. I'd never even finished college. Couldn't afford to after my mom got sick. Everything I knew about business I'd learned through hustle, night classes, and pure determination. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when Marcus asked, "And your team? Who else is involved in this strategic planning?" Ethan's eyes found mine across the room. For a split second, I thought I saw something, regret, maybe? But then his expression hardened into something cold and dismissive. "Well, we did have an assistant helping with some of the number crunching," he said, his voice dripping with casual indifference. "But you know how it is with support staff. They come and go." Support staff. 6 months of bleeding my soul onto spreadsheets, and I was support staff. The investors chuckled, as if the very idea of an assistant contributing meaningful work was amusing. I felt my face burn with humiliation, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. "Actually," Ethan continued, and I should have seen what was coming next, "Mia here is a perfect example of what I always tell young professionals. Know your place, focus on your strengths, and don't try to reach beyond your capabilities." He gestured toward me, and suddenly every pair of eyes in that room was staring at me like I was an exhibit in a museum. "You'll always be a nobody, Mia. Stick to budgeting my coffee runs." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was dismissive. Like I wasn't even worth cruelty. In fact, Ethan's voice carried across the rooftop, "I think it's time for a change. Mia, consider this your notice. We'll have your final paycheck ready Monday." He fired me. In front of 30 investors, he fired me using my own work as the backdrop. And then, God, this still makes my chest tight, he walked over to where Sophia Martinez was standing. Sophia, with her perfectly straight hair and her daddy's connections and her Ivy League pedigree. He slipped his arm around her waist and kissed her temple. "This is my girlfriend, Sophia," he announced to the room. "She'll be joining the Crossline team as our new strategic partnerships director." I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, watching the man I'd loved and trusted and believed in replace me in every possible way. Professionally,
Personally.
completely. Someone handed me my purse. Someone else mumbled something about the elevator. Somehow, I found myself on the sidewalk 40 floors below, staring up at the lights of the party that was continuing without me. That was 3 years ago. 3 long years of freelance bookkeeping gigs, rejected business proposals, and watching Ethan's face smile back at me from magazine covers and conference billboards. Crossline Athletic had indeed become a household name, exactly like my strategy had predicted it would. But here's the thing about being called a nobody. It gives you a special kind of motivation. And today, as I sat in my cramped studio apartment sorting through yet another stack of overdue bills, something beautiful happened. My laptop was playing a business podcast in the background when I heard it. Crossline Athletic facing potential supply chain disruption as their primary manufacturing partner in Ohio struggles with financial difficulties. I looked up from my bills. Slowly, I reached for my laptop and rewound the segment. Sources close to the situation suggest that Hartwell Manufacturing, which has an exclusive contract with Crossline, may be facing foreclosure. Hartwell Manufacturing. I knew that name. I grabbed my phone and started digging. 3 hours later, I was staring at financial records, property assessments, and tax documents that painted a very interesting picture. Ethan's entire empire, built on my strategy, was hanging by a thread. And that thread was about to be cut by a bank in Ohio. I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time in months. Maybe it was time for this nobody to become somebody after all. The drive to Millfield, Ohio took me 4 hours through endless cornfields and small towns that time seemed to have forgotten. I'd rented a Honda Civic, nothing flashy, and thrown on my most professional-looking blazer over a simple white blouse. The goal was to look competent but not threatening. Helpful, not predatory. Hartwell Manufacturing sat on the outskirts of town like a relic from another era. The brick buildings stretched across several acres, with loading docks and chain-link fencing that had seen better days. But the parking lot was full, and I could hear the hum of machinery from inside. This wasn't a dead factory, not yet. I sat in my rental car for 10 minutes, rehearsing my story and watching workers come and go during their lunch break. Most looked like they'd been here for decades.
Good.
Experienced workers were exactly what I needed to know about. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my briefcase, borrowed from my neighbor who worked in insurance, and walked toward the main office. The receptionist was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her nameplate read Dorothy Jenkins. "Good afternoon," I said, flashing my most genuine smile. "I'm Mia Williams from Midwest Financial Solutions." The fake name rolled off my tongue easier than I'd expected. "I was hoping to speak with someone about your current financial situation. We specialize in helping manufacturing companies restructure debt and avoid foreclosure." Dorothy's face immediately shifted from polite professionalism to genuine concern. "Oh my, you want to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell? Let me see if they're available." She disappeared into a back office, and I heard muffled voices. When she returned, she was followed by a couple who looked to be in their 70s. The man was tall and lean with calloused hands that spoke of decades of manual work. The woman was shorter, with worry lines etched deep around her eyes. "I'm George Hartwell," the man said, extending his hand. "This is my wife, Carol. Dorothy says you might be able to help us with our situation." "I hope so," I replied, shaking both their hands. "Would it be possible to sit down and discuss your options? I know these conversations can be difficult, but sometimes an outside perspective can reveal solutions you might not have considered." Carol Hartwell glanced at her husband, and I saw 30 years of partnership pass between them in that look. They were scared, but they were also desperate enough to trust a stranger. "Come on back to our office," George said. Their office was cramped but organized, with filing cabinets lining the walls and a coffee pot that looked like it had been brewing the same pot since the Clinton administration. Family photos covered every available surface: children, grandchildren, company picnics from decades past. "We built this place from nothing," Carol began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "George inherited $50,000 from his father in 1985, and we put every penny into this factory. For 39 years, we've employed half this town." George picked up the story. "We've had our ups and downs, but nothing like this. Medical bills, Carol's cancer treatment 3 years ago, some bad investments our accountant recommended." He trailed off, shaking his head. "The worst part," Carol continued, "is that we have steady business. One major client, very reliable, but the cash flow timing never quite lines up with our obligations." I leaned forward, keeping my expression sympathetic but professional. "Can you tell me about that client relationship?" "Crossline Athletic," George said with obvious pride. "They signed an exclusive 5-year contract with us back in 2020. Best thing that ever happened to this place. Steady orders, premium pricing, exclusive manufacturing rights for their entire line." My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice level. "That sounds like a strong foundation. What's the timeline on that contract?" "Expires in November," Carol said. "But they've been so happy with our work, I'm sure they'll renew. They'd be crazy not to. We're the only facility in the Midwest that can handle their specific fabric technology and quality standards." "And they don't have any other manufacturing partners?" I asked, pulling out a notebook to look official. "None," George confirmed. "We retooled our entire operation for their specifications. Invested over $2 million in new machinery. They need us as much as we need them." I scribbled notes, my mind racing. "What's your current debt situation, if you don't mind me asking?" Carol pulled out a folder thick with papers. "We owe $340,000 in back taxes, another $200,000 on equipment loans, and about $100,000 in various penalties and fees. The bank's threatening foreclosure. Auction is scheduled for..." She checked a legal document. "October 15th, 6 weeks from today." "But once Crossline renews," George added quickly, "we'll have the cash flow to handle everything. We just need to bridge the gap until November." I looked at their earnest faces, these two people who'd built something real with their own hands, and felt a stab of guilt about my deception. But then I remembered Ethan's voice. "You'll always be a nobody, Mia. What happens if Crossline doesn't renew?" I asked gently. The silence that followed was deafening. "They will," Carol whispered, but I could hear the fear underneath her words. "Of course they will," George agreed, but his hand reached for his wife's, and I saw the tremor he was trying to hide. I closed my notebook and looked at them both. "I think I might be able to help you. Can I have 24 hours to review some options?" As I drove back toward Chicago that evening, my mind was spinning with possibilities. The Hartwells were good people caught in an impossible situation. Ethan's empire was built on their backs, and he probably slept soundly every night, never thinking about the elderly couple whose entire livelihood depended on his whims. But in 6 weeks, everything would change, and I was going to make sure it changed in exactly the right way. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in invisible warfare. While Ethan probably spent his days in glass conference rooms making decisions about marketing budgets and celebrity endorsements, I was in my cramped apartment orchestrating the most elaborate chess game of my life. Step 1. Resurrection of old connections. I started with Marcus Chun, a venture capitalist I'd impressed during my brief stint at Morrison & Associates back in 2019. I'd helped him identify a flaw in a biotech startup's financial projections that saved his firm $3 million. He owed me a favor, though he probably didn't remember the quiet black woman who'd handed him that analysis. "Marcus, this is Mia Harper. We worked together on the Biogen deal a few years back." "Mia." "Of course, how are you? I heard you went independent. Smart move in this market." The lie came easily. "I'm calling because I've identified an extraordinary opportunity in manufacturing. Distressed asset, perfect fundamentals, just needs strategic intervention. I'm putting together a small investor group." "What sector?" "Athletic apparel manufacturing. The facility has exclusive contracts with major brands, but is facing short-term liquidity issues. Classic cash flow versus asset value disconnect." I could hear the interest in his voice. Marcus had built his reputation on finding diamonds in the rough. "Send me the deck," he said. There was no deck. Yet. The next call went to Isabella Rodriguez, a private equity partner who'd once told me I had the sharpest analytical mind she'd ever encountered after I'd identified market inefficiencies during a consulting project. Isabella was old money, the kind of woman who could write a $250,000 check without blinking. Mia, darling, what a pleasant surprise. I was just thinking about that brilliant analysis you did on the retail consolidation trends. Isabella, I have an opportunity that's right in your wheelhouse. Manufacturing acquisition, below market entry point, significant upside potential. I'm listening. By the end of that first week, I had tentative commitments for $800,000 from 5 different investors. None of them knew about the others. All of them trusted my track record enough to move forward based on preliminary conversations. But I needed more than money. I needed invisibility. Step 2. Corporate camouflage. Finding a lawyer willing to set up a shell LLC for cash was easier than I'd expected. Delaware corporate law is practically designed for people who want to hide their identities. For $3,000, Riverside Holdings LLC came into existence with me as the sole managing member, using a registered agent service for the address. The name was perfect, boring enough to be forgettable, generic enough to mean nothing to anyone who might investigate. Step 3. The debt purchase. This was the delicate part. Banks don't usually sell distressed debt to unknown entities, but they also don't want to deal with foreclosure proceedings if they can avoid it. I needed to approach this like a legitimate investment opportunity, not a personal vendetta. I spent 4 days creating a comprehensive financial package for Riverside Holdings. Professional letterhead, fabricated operating history, references from my real consulting clients who had no idea they were vouching for a company that existed only on paper. The key was making Hartwell Manufacturing look like exactly what it was, a fundamentally sound business with temporary cash flow problems. I highlighted their exclusive contract with Crossline, their skilled workforce, their specialized equipment. I positioned the debt purchase as a straightforward value investment. When I called First National Bank of Ohio, I was armed with confidence and a plan. "This is Jennifer Walsh from Riverside Holdings," I said, using a slightly different voice than my normal one. "We specialize in manufacturing sector investments, and we understand you have a distressed asset in Millfield that might align with our acquisition criteria." The loan officer, David Patterson, was surprisingly forthcoming. "The Hartwell situation is unfortunate. Good people, solid business fundamentals, just got behind on their obligations. We prefer to avoid foreclosure, if possible. What would it take to assume the debt position? The total exposure is approximately $640,000, including penalties and interest. We'd consider a purchase at 70 cents on the dollar, assuming the buyer commits to working with the current owners on a restructuring plan. $450,000. Less than Ethan probably spent on his marketing budget last quarter. We'd be interested in reviewing the complete file," I said. 2 days later, I was sitting in my car outside First National Bank of Ohio with a wire transfer confirmation on my phone and legal ownership of George and Carol Hartwell's entire debt. But here's where it got interesting. Instead of swooping in and taking control, I did something no one expected. I became their silent guardian angel. I restructured the payment plan to give them 6 months of breathing room. I paid the back taxes anonymously through a Chicago law firm. I arranged for the penalties to be forgiven through a hardship program that I'd essentially created by talking to the right people and paying the right fees. To the Hartwells, it looked like bureaucratic miracles were suddenly happening. Their lawyer called it unprecedented cooperation from the municipal authorities. To Ethan, if he was paying attention at all, the factory looked like it was somehow limping along for a few more months, but still fundamentally unstable. What none of them knew was that I now owned everything. The building, the equipment, the land, even the parking lot where Ethan parked his Tesla during his monthly visits. I owned the machine that made his success possible. And I had plans for that machine. 2 weeks later, I got the text I'd been waiting for. George Hartwell had mentioned during one of our restructuring consultations that Ethan always visited the factory on the first Tuesday of every month. Like clockwork, George had said. Likes to walk the floor, check on production, make sure we're keeping up his standards. The way George said his standards told me everything I needed to know about how those visits usually went. I drove to Millfield that Tuesday morning and parked across the street from the factory in a borrowed SUV with tinted windows. At exactly 10:30 a.m., a black Tesla Model S pulled into the parking lot. My heart rate jumped as I watched Ethan step out, checking his phone and adjusting his designer jacket like he was walking onto a movie set instead of into a manufacturing facility. He looked exactly the same. Perfectly styled hair, that confident stride that said he owned everything he looked at. Except now I knew something he didn't. Technically, I owned everything he was looking at. I watched him disappear into the building and waited. 15 minutes later, I slipped through the back entrance I'd noticed during my previous visits. The factory floor was loud enough that no one noticed an extra person in a hard hat and safety vest I'd picked up from a construction supply store. Finding Ethan wasn't hard. You could hear his voice over the machinery. Quality control issue in last month's shipment, he was saying to George, who stood next to him with the patient expression of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. My customers expect perfection, not good enough. Ethan, the defect rate was 0.02%, George replied calmly. That's well within industry standards. In fact, it's exceptional. Industry standards aren't Crossline standards, Ethan shot back. I didn't build my brand by accepting mediocrity. Your brand, I thought, watching from behind a row of cutting machines. Built on my strategy. Ethan continued his tour like a king surveying his domain, pointing out minor issues, making suggestions that sounded more like demands. When they reached the section where Carol was overseeing the embroidery operation, I saw her smile politely as Ethan explained how she could optimize workflow efficiency, using management speak to describe work she'd been doing since before he was born. The thing is, Ethan said, his voice carrying that casual arrogance I remembered so well, you folks have been lucky to have me as a client. Most companies would have moved production overseas years ago. I keep my manufacturing domestic because I believe in American quality, but that loyalty isn't unlimited. George's face tightened almost imperceptibly. We appreciate the partnership, Ethan. Always have. Good. Because with my contract renewal coming up, I need to know you understand how fortunate you are. I mean, without Crossline, what would you be? Another failed factory in small-town Ohio. Carol's hands stilled on the fabric she was examining. I saw her jaw clench, and I felt a surge of anger so pure it surprised me. You're right, George said quietly. We know how much Crossline means to us. Ethan clapped him on the shoulder with fake friendliness. That's what I like to hear. Just remember, I can take my business anywhere. You need me a lot more than I need you. I'd heard enough. I slipped back outside and sat in my car, hands shaking with rage. He hadn't changed at all. Same entitled attitude, same casual cruelty to people who depended on him. The only difference was that now he had power over an entire community's livelihood instead of just mine. But not for much longer. That afternoon, I drove back to Chicago and went straight to my lawyer's office. I need you to draft a contract termination notice, I told him. Formal, legal, no room for interpretation. What grounds? Contract expiration with notice of non-renewal. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at Crossline's corporate headquarters. I know because I called their main office pretending to be from the delivery service, confirming receipt. The letter was simple and devastating. Dear Mr. Cross, this notice serves to inform you that Hartwell Manufacturing, LLC, has been acquired by Riverside Holdings. Upon review of all existing contracts, we regret to inform you that your manufacturing agreement will not be renewed upon its expiration date of November 30th, 2024. Please make arrangements for the conclusion of all outstanding orders by this date. Sincerely, Riverside Holdings Management. My phone rang 6 hours later. This is Ethan Cross from Crossline Athletic. I need to speak with someone about this ridiculous letter immediately. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to it 5 times, savoring every note of panic in his voice. The next call came an hour later. Then another. By the end of the day, he'd left 7 increasingly desperate messages, offering double the contract value, then triple, then whatever it takes to resolve this misunderstanding. On Friday, he showed up at the factory in person, demanding to meet with whoever's in charge of this Riverside Holdings situation. That's when I made my second call to George Hartwell. George, this is Mia Williams. I think it's time you knew who really bought your debt. When I told him, the silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Sweet mother of God, he finally whispered. That boy has no idea what's coming for him, does he? No, I said, smiling for the first time in weeks. He really doesn't. The trap was set. Now it was time to spring it. The meeting request came through my lawyer's office on a Monday morning, typed on crossline athletic letterhead with all the desperation hidden behind corporate formality. Riverside Holdings Management, Crossline Athletic respectfully requests an urgent meeting to discuss mutually beneficial terms for contract continuation. We believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding our partnership value and are prepared to offer significantly enhanced compensation for immediate resolution. I stared at the letter for a full minute, savoring every carefully chosen word. 3 years ago, this same man had destroyed my life without a second thought. Now he was begging for a meeting with someone he didn't even know was me. I scheduled it for Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. downtown Chicago, in the conference room of the law firm representing Riverside Holdings. Neutral ground, professional setting, witnesses, but most importantly, a stage for the performance I'd been rehearsing for 3 years. Thursday morning, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror practicing my entrance. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a charcoal gray power suit that fit like armor, black heels that added 3 inches to my height, and my grandmother's pearl earrings for luck. My hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and I'd spent more on makeup that morning than I usually spent on groceries in a week. I looked like success. I looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms making million-dollar decisions. I looked like everything Ethan had told me I'd never be. At 1:55 p.m., I walked into the 32nd floor conference room where Ethan was already waiting. He was pacing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight with stress. Don't care what it costs, find me alternative manufacturing options. Check Mexico, Vietnam, anywhere that can handle our specifications. He turned as I entered, and his words died mid-sentence. For a moment, neither of us moved. His phone slipped slightly in his hand as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. Hello, Ethan, I said, my voice steady and professional. Thank you for coming. He ended his call without saying goodbye, his eyes never leaving my face. I could see the exact moment the pieces clicked together, the confusion shifting to recognition, then to disbelief, then to something that looked almost like fear. Mia? His voice cracked slightly on my name. Please sit down. I gestured to the chair across from me as I took my place at the head of the table. I understand you wanted to discuss the Hartwell manufacturing situation. He remained standing, his hands gripping the back of the chair. You're Riverside Holdings. I am. But how when he shook his head, trying to regain his composure. Look, whatever this is about, we can work it out. If you're upset about how things ended between us.
Sit down.
The command in my voice surprised even me. This was new, this feeling of being the one with power, the one in control. I liked it. Ethan sat. Do you remember what you said to me on that rooftop 3 years ago? I asked, leaning back in my chair with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards. Mia, that was business. You have to understand. You called me a nobody. My voice was quiet, almost conversational. In front of 30 investors, after using my work to build your entire company, you told me I would always be a nobody and should stick to budgeting coffee runs. His face flushed. I was under a lot of pressure. The investors were expecting. And then you fired me, using my own strategy presentation as the backdrop. I opened the folder in front of me, revealing printed copies of every email, every document, every piece of analysis I'd created for Crossline. Do you recognize these, Ethan? He glanced at the papers, and I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. Your contract with Hartwell Manufacturing expires in 6 weeks. It will not be renewed. The factory that has been the backbone of your entire operation, The facility that knows your specifications, your quality standards, your trade secrets will no longer be available to you. Mia, be reasonable. I'll double your fee.
Triple it.
Whatever you want. What I want, I said, standing and walking to the window, is for you to understand something. 3 years ago, you were right. I was nobody. I had no power, no connections, no ability to fight back when you decided to destroy me. I turned to face him, and I could see him calculating, searching for an angle, a way to manipulate the situation back in his favor. But I'm not that person anymore. And the beautiful thing about becoming somebody is that you get to choose what happens to the people who treated you like nobody. What do you want? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to know that while you've been building your empire on my foundation, I've been learning, growing, becoming exactly the person you said I never could be. I smiled, and it felt like sunshine after years of rain. I want you to know that Novatech Athletics contacted me yesterday. They're very interested in exclusive manufacturing rights for their new line. The color drained from his face. Novatech was Crossline's biggest competitor. You can't do this, he said, standing abruptly. I built this company. You built it on my strategy, using my ideas, after discarding me like trash. I walked back to my chair, every step deliberate and measured. And now I own the machine that makes it all possible. Name your price. There is no price, Ethan. This isn't about money. Then what? I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had once seemed larger than life, who had made me feel small and worthless and disposable. Now he just looked ordinary, desperate, human. This is about justice, I said quietly. And justice, it turns out, tastes exactly as sweet as I thought it would. I gathered my papers and stood to leave. Mia, wait. I paused at the door and looked back at him one last time. You were right about one thing, Ethan. I'll never be a nobody again. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I walked toward the elevator with my head held high, leaving the sound of his desperation echoing in the conference room behind me. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in November, just 2 weeks after our boardroom confrontation. Crossline Athletic faces production crisis as manufacturing partner terminates contract, Business Weekly. Supply chain disruption threatens popular athletic brand's holiday season, Chicago Tribune. Crossline stock plummets 40% following manufacturing partnership loss, Financial Times. I read every article over my morning coffee, sitting in the same cramped apartment where I'd spent 3 years rebuilding my life. The headlines felt like vindication served on a silver platter. But the real satisfaction came from a different kind of news. The story that wouldn't make the financial pages, but mattered more than any stock price. Mia, you saved our lives, Carol Hartwell said, her voice thick with emotion as we stood on the factory floor that was now officially mine. George and I, we thought we were going to lose everything. 40 years of work just gone. Around us, the machinery hummed with the same steady rhythm it had maintained for decades, but the energy was different now. The workers moved with purpose instead of anxiety. For the first time in months, they knew their jobs were secure. You didn't just save the factory, George added, shaking my hand with the firm grip of a man who'd spent his life building things. You saved this whole town. Half the families here depend on this place. What I hadn't told them yet was that saving their jobs had been the easy part. The real work was just beginning. George, Carol, I said, gesturing for them to follow me to the office where this all started. I have a proposition for you. 20 minutes later, after I'd outlined my plan, Carol was wiping tears from her eyes and George was staring at me like I'd just performed a miracle. You want us to be partners? Carol whispered. Equal partners? You know this business better than anyone, I said. You know the workers, the processes, the quality standards. I know the market, the strategy, the financial side. Together, we can build something better than anything Ethan ever imagined. And that's how HarperCore Athletic was born. The beauty of it was almost poetic. The same machines that had produced Ethan's vision of athletic wear would now create something completely different, clothing designed for real people living real lives. We kept the quality standards, but expanded the size ranges. We maintained the technical innovation but made it accessible to everyone, not just elite athletes with elite budgets. Our first line launched 3 months later with a campaign that told the truth. Athletic wear for every body, every dream, every story that matters. The response was overwhelming. Orders poured in from retailers who had been asking their suppliers for exactly what we were offering: inclusive, high-quality athletic wear at reasonable prices. Within 6 months, we had a waiting list that stretched into the following year. Meanwhile, Ethan's world was crumbling with a kind of spectacular collapse that business schools would probably study for decades. Without Hartwell Manufacturing, Crossline couldn't meet their holiday orders. The desperate scramble to find new production partners led to quality control disasters and shipping delays. Customers defected to competitors. Investors pulled funding. The brand that had once seemed unstoppable was hemorrhaging money and credibility. The final twist came on a Friday afternoon in March, exactly 1 year after that boardroom confrontation. I had Sophia, my assistant, not Ethan's girlfriend. Thankfully, they'd broken up when his company started failing, deliver a package to Crossline's corporate headquarters. Inside was a simple black frame containing a cocktail napkin from the Meridian Building rooftop, with 5 words embossed in gold foil. Nobody, huh? Along with it was a handwritten note. Thank you for the motivation. MH, CEO, HarperCore Athletic. I never found out if Ethan opened that package personally, but I like to imagine he did. I like to imagine him sitting in his shrinking office, staring at that napkin, finally understanding the true cost of underestimating people. 6 months later, I was standing in the same factory where George had once worried about losing everything, watching our newest production line install state-of-the-art equipment funded by our latest round of investor funding. Carol was training new employees on quality standards. George was consulting with engineers on efficiency improvements. The Hartwell name remained on the building, but now it stood for something bigger than survival. It stood for possibility. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Crossline Athletic files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. I looked at the notification for a moment, then deleted it without reading the full article. You were right, Ethan. I thought as I watched our workers carefully crafting athletic where that would help people feel confident and strong. I wasn't somebody back then. I was nobody. Just a woman with ideas and dreams, and a heart full of determination.
But now?
Now I own everything you built on my back. I employ the people you took for granted. I serve the customers you ignored. I've built the company you never had the vision to create. Most importantly, I've become exactly who I was always meant to be, not because you believed in me, but because you didn't. And that, I realized as I smiled and walked back into my factory, was the most beautiful revenge of all. Sometimes the best way to prove someone wrong isn't to argue with them. It's to become everything they said you never could be, and then some.